Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Cold Rivals, the new era of U.S.-China strategic competition, edited by Evan S. Medeiros, narrated by Tom Parks. Introduction: A New Strategic Reality, Evan S. Medeiros. As the U.S.-China relationship enters its fifth decade, profound changes are afoot. In the last 5 years alone, the relationship has experienced one of its most significant evolutions since normalization in 1979. Tensions are rising, differences are expanding, and interactions are more complex. U.S.-China ties are now commonly and frequently described as a strategic competition, a great power struggle, and even a new Cold War. Gone are the days of policymakers referencing the virtues of dialogue, communication, and cooperation. Even the talk of balancing cooperation and competition is now outdated, if not obsolescent. U.S. President Joe Biden, in February 2021, just 1 month after his inauguration, referred to U.S.-China interactions as extreme competition, and his administration has continued using similar characterizations since then. For his part, China's President Xi Jinping is reported as saying in an internal meeting, "The biggest source of chaos in the present-day world is the United States, and the United States is the biggest threat to our country's development and security." This shift in rhetoric has corresponded with a steady stream of criticism from both Washington and Beijing about each other's policies and behaviors, as well as a rapid decline in both official government dialogues and unofficial business, civil society, and educational interactions. Of course, the rolling global pandemic that began in 2020 has made all of this worse. It both broadened and deepened the deterioration in perceptions and interactions. As of 2023, U.S.-China ties stand between a gradual decline and a precipitous deterioration that produces a crisis or even a confrontation. Washington and Beijing may be one crisis away from a very different reality in U.S.-China ties, evocative of the U.S.-Soviet contest of the 1950s. The deeper currents in the relationship are even more worrisome. Each nation's negative images of the other are pervasive and hardening, linked not just to current tensions, but the internal politics and external ambitions of each country. The idea of a U.S.-China ideological competition has moved from the fringe to the core of the debate. The relationship is also experiencing a structural shift from one in which both sides' national interests are compatible in some arenas to one in which differences are expanding and intensifying in multiple arenas, and the few remaining arenas of seeming compatibility are crowded out by the growing number of differences. As of this writing, American and Chinese national interests diverge more than they converge, and on a broader set of issues: economic, diplomatic, political, technological, and on questions of values and governance. Policymakers, business leaders, scholars, and analysts in both countries are struggling both to understand the changing nature of U.S.-China ties in this new context and its future trajectory, and to determine what to do about it. U.S. debates about whether this is a new Cold War are now widespread. U.S. and Chinese scholars and analysts have devoted significant time and energy to understanding the similarities and differences between the prior era and the present day, and the appropriateness of the old term to the new context. From the vantage point of 2023, and especially after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, many American strategists view this turn toward strategic competition as enduring rather than ephemeral. The last few years have revealed a growing number of differences in interests, values, and outlooks that formed the basis of a long-term rivalry. China's alignment with Russia in February 2022, just 20 days before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, had a substantial impact on U.S. perceptions of Chinese intentions and ambitions, just as Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan in August 2022 had a major impact on Chinese perceptions of U.S. intentions toward China. However, scholars and analysts differ about why this change in U.S.-China dynamics has occurred. Some attribute it to classic power transition ideas, in which the narrowing of the relative power gap has led Washington to become more focused on Beijing's capabilities. This line of argumentation is common in China, with some even attributing a number to it. Once the Chinese economy became 70% of the U.S. economy, the relationship was bound to become more contentious. Others in the United States and China see this downward trend as linked to domestic politics in both countries and the hardening perceptions of elites and publics. A common view in China is that the United States is a declining superpower that needs an external threat to justify its hegemony and high defense expenditures to keep a decaying economy moving, especially after the devastation of the coronavirus. A third perspective grounds the shift in the relationship to the ascension of Xi Jinping. His statist, repressive actions at home, combined with assertive and coercive behaviors abroad, have put China on a trajectory toward long-term discord with U.S. interests and values. Across these and other explanations run a set of common questions. Was the shift inevitable? Are the United States and China destined for long-term rivalry or confrontation? U.S. and Chinese assessments of the current state of the U.S.-China relationship are replete with speculation about the future. Predictions range from the moderate to the dire, with the possibilities narrowing toward the latter in recent years as relationships have deteriorated. For some, conflict is inevitable due to China's growing ambitions and capabilities, and American unwillingness to tolerate the diversity of challenges from China. Others see the situation as manageable, reflecting a belief that some combination of leadership, interdependence, and the high costs of conflict will prevail. Of course, the risk of an accident or miscalculation that triggers a negative spiral is ever present, though some argue that this risk is rising as dialogue and interaction decline. Most of these forecasts are equally logical. That is, the causal links are clear and often historically grounded, and have a reasonable probability of materializing. Given the flux in the structure of the current international system, especially as unipolarity fades, perhaps the best way of looking at the future of the U.S.-China relationship is as a Rorschach test. One's view of the future of the U.S.-China relationship reflects one's views of how the world works. The relative restraint imposed by economic interdependence and nuclear weapons, the nature of U.S. power, Chinese ambitions as a rising power, the type of international order we live in, and the importance of regime type in shaping a country's ambitions and actions. Thus, as of this writing, it is exceedingly difficult to predict with great precision how the U.S.-China relationship will evolve in the next few years, let alone in the following decades. This book does not claim to do so, but it offers some directions and guideposts. Neither Beijing nor Washington say meaningful things about the future beyond bland rhetoric about seeking peace, stability, prosperity, and respect. A central premise of this book is that the relationship will be shaped, at least in part, by events that have yet to occur, events within both countries, around them, and, importantly, between them. For the United States, the degree of domestic economic and political revitalization will matter as much in its competition with China as, and perhaps more than, its ability to generate and sustain international coalitions to shape Chinese behaviors. For China, the next decade will be momentous for its economic and political development, with Xi taking several bets about the success of his authoritarian and statist vision. Domestically, will China rebalance its growth model, exit the middle income trap, and avoid the economic challenges posed by its imposing demographic challenges? Externally, Xi is betting on China's economic gravity, diplomatic presence, and military prowess to reduce external pressure and increase China's freedom of action in Asia and globally. Of course, then there is the momentous question of when Xi will turn over the reins to the next generation of political leaders and how they will manage China's ties with America. Finally, the interaction between the United States and China, the people, the trade, the behaviors, is one of the most important and often underappreciated factors in determining the future of the relationship. If history teaches us anything about the relationship, it is that these interactions shape the perceptions, the politics, and, in some cases, the policies that collectively constitute and motivate the U.S.-China relationship. These interactions, when combined with the other factors, underscore the highly contingent nature of the relationship. This edited volume seeks to contribute to this debate about the current character and future trajectory of U.S.-China ties. It seeks to do so by opening the aperture on this new era of strategic competition in U.S.-China relations. The volume does so by examining the origins, manifestations, and implications of this shift in the relationship toward persistent and pervasive competition. It strives to answer several pivotal questions. First, how and why did this era emerge? How deep are its roots? What are its attributes? Was it inevitable? Second, what kinds of behaviors and dynamics will competition produce, and to what extent will they differ depending on the issue? Third, what are the implications for the future of U.S.-China relations, including outside of Asia, and on global issues? As competition evolves, is confrontation inevitable? And what issue or set of issues will drive it in that direction? The core goal of this collection of essays is to understand the nature of this generalized shift from an era marked by dialogue, interaction, management, and cooperation to one defined by disagreement, friction, disengagement, and competition. Why did this happen? What does it mean now? How will it manifest? Is it enduring? A central premise of this edited volume is that there is little that is inevitable in the U.S.-China relationship. History has proven that it is a highly contingent relationship whose trajectory has been shaped by domestic capabilities and political events in both countries, regional events in Asia, global events, and, importantly, the interactions between the two countries. Thus, it is the interplay of these large variables that helps us understand the emergence of this new era of competition and where relations might go in the future. The chapters in this volume discuss competition from both a historical and a contemporary perspective in order to understand the roots of diverging interests, as well as the factors that help the two countries manage differences in the past and may constrain them in the future. Framing and explaining U.S.-China competition. The chapters in this volume examine and analyze from several angles the evolution of competition in U.S.-China relations since normalization in 1979. Some chapters are historically oriented, and others are contemporary. The chapters, written by prominent specialists from both countries, incorporate both U.S. and Chinese perspectives. Specifically, the chapters explore U.S.-China competition from a diversity of functional perspectives: history, politics and economics, defense and security concerns, questions of technology, and the future of the relationship. The edited volume is structured into 5 sections corresponding to these issues. Among the authors, there is broad agreement that competition has long been a feature of the relationship, but that its drivers, character, intensity, and manifestations have evolved substantially. While the authors uniformly agree that competition today has become the core dynamic in the relationship, many argue that this outcome was not inevitable, and neither is the drift from competition to confrontation. However, the authors differ in their assessment of which dynamics, security, economics, technology, or ideas, have been the main contributors to this new era. There are differing assessments of the historical pathway competition has taken and its attributes today. There is a notable divide between U.S. and Chinese authors about Chinese perceptions and contributions to this era of competition, with Chinese specialists putting less emphasis on competitive dynamics in the evolution of China's policymaking and more on China's defensive motives in the face of increasing U.S. pressure over many decades. A conceptual and historical framework. The first section of this volume looks at U.S.-China competition from a conceptual and a historical perspective. What does the concept of competition mean when applied to U.S.-China relations? And what can history teach us about the evolution of competition in U.S.-China interactions? In Chapter 1, Explaining and Understanding Competition in U.S.-China Relations, Evan Medeiros argues that the concept of competition is under-theorized in the field of international politics and in U.S.-China relations. To address this, his chapter seeks to define the meaning of competition, what kinds of behaviors do and do not constitute competition, and then apply these ideas to the history of U.S.-China interactions. Drawing on recent studies of competition in great power politics, Medeiros argues that competition requires at least 3 conditions: perceived contention, an effort to gain mutual advantage, and the pursuit of some outcome or good that is not generally available. This definition applies to a state's pursuit of power, influence, status, and/or material goods, when others seek the same things and the supply of them is limited. Thus, competition exists when gaining access to some of these scarce items would confer a relative advantage of one state over another. In this sense, Medeiros argues that competition is different from conflict, which is a more intense varietal, and different from disagreement or contestation, which is less intense and implies merely a difference of views. Moreover, Medeiros maintains that competition between and among states can be over specific goals, such as who controls a piece of land or maritime feature, as well as broader ones, such as regional leadership, a dominant economic position, and/or global status. Based on this approach to competition, Medeiros' chapter then applies this definition to the 40-year history of U.S.-China interactions since normalization. He argues that perhaps the most defining feature of the relationship over the past 4 decades has been the persistence of divergent perceptions and interests amid a shared desire to pursue common economic interests and at times diplomatic goals. In this sense, while competition has existed for much of the past 40 years, it also has been bounded by both sides for the sake of common interests, even short-lived ones. The interventions of U.S. and Chinese leaders to steady the relationship at critical times was an important source of ballast, for example. However, Medeiros continues that, over time, differences in perceptions, interests, and capabilities expanded, and, as a result, the nature and scope of bilateral competition intensified. In surveying the last 40-plus years, and especially the last 5, Medeiros argues that one of the most significant drivers of competition has been the coercive nature of the economic, diplomatic, and military policies used by both sides, which has had the practical effect of intensifying the perceptions of disagreement, divergence, and ultimately contention. At the same time, the sources of stability in the relationship and the buffers against seeing the other as an inevitable rival began to fade away. This, in turn, accelerated the real contention at the heart of the bilateral competition, a broader set of clearly diverging interests, which then produced the era of strategic competition. In Chapter 2, Old Cold War and New, Richard Betts compares the features of the old U.S.-Soviet Cold War to U.S.-China relations today, which he calls a new Cold War. Betts argues that the similarities outweigh the differences in comparing the two situations, offering insights into how to understand U.S.-China competition today. Betts argues that the core similarity is a bipolar structure of the international system, based on his belief that structure drives outcomes. While appreciating the debate about such a stark claim, Betts's core argument is that there was no third country in the same league of overall national power as the United States and the USSR then, and, despite Russian belligerence, there is no other state now in the same league as the United States and the PRC. Drawing on this conception of order, Betts further develops his argument by noting that in both instances, the stakes, power, and motives are concentrated in the 3 dimensions of military, economic, and political power, albeit in differing configurations today in U.S.-China interactions. In his account, the old Cold War was driven most intensely by political divisions over ideology, next by military confrontation, and third and least by economic competition. Today, between the United States and China, the order of these drivers in the new Cold War is reversed: economics, military, and then ideology. Betts argues that the biggest question is whether economic or military competition will dominate. Betts's chapter then systematically compares U.S.-Soviet and U.S.-China dynamics in all 3 domains, with important insights about the differences and similarities in each category. Drawing on his analysis of competition in these 3 arenas, Betts argues that, unlike during the Cold War, the main risk of conflict in the U.S.-China context today is not a deliberate military action, but rather an accident or miscalculation. Betts concludes that the new Cold War is likely to deepen as competition in all 3 arenas intensifies and the risk of inadvertent conflict grows. This risk is especially pronounced in the early stages of the new Cold War, as the boundaries of competition have not yet been set. Betts notes that ambiguity may help reinforce deterrence now, such as regarding Taiwan, but it could also be the source of a miscalculation going forward. Optimistically, he adds that the latter conclusion has an underlying positivity because it implies neither Washington nor Beijing has an interest in launching a deliberate conflict due to an awareness of the high costs. In this first section on historical perspectives, Harry Harding and Wang Jisoo take a different approach from Betts, both focusing exclusively on U.S.-China dynamics. They respectively examine the evolution of Chinese and U.S. views on the rise of competition. In Chapter 3, The United States and China, Harding takes a similar approach to Wang by tracing the evolution of the last 40 years of U.S.-China interactions and America's China policy to draw lessons for our understanding of competition. However, he tells a very different story about the evolution of differences, distrust, and antagonism. Harding begins by describing a relationship that was stable but also challenged even fragile during the golden era of the 1980s. Bilateral ties were then severely disrupted by Tiananmen in 1989 and never regained their footing. In the 1990s, Washington and Beijing were able to find a stable basis for their relationship based on China's contributions to regional and global challenges, and its desire, indeed its need, for continued and expanded access to U.S. markets, capital, and technology to reach its ambitious development goals. Importantly, these Chinese goals resonated with the broader U.S. strategy to shape and socialize China into a constructive rising power. This basic and implicit modus vivendi for U.S.-China ties then extended into the 2000s. Harding writes that in the 1990s and 2000s, tensions were not far below the surface because none of the previous differences, like Taiwan or market access, had been resolved, and new ones crept onto the agenda. Beyond this narrative history, Harding's chapter considers analytic questions such as why and how the U.S. pursued a paradigm of engagement, why it ultimately produced a new paradigm of strategic competition, and where U.S. policy and U.S.-China relations will go from here. Harding argues that the engagement toolkit included a bevy of policies, including promoting dialogue, building personal relationships, offering reassurance, fostering interdependence, building negotiation mechanisms, integrating China into international organizations, and articulating an aspirational framework for relations. Yet the application of all of these tools was fraught with challenges, and ultimately failed due to differing interests and goals for the relationship. Harding argues that there was a superficial quality to these approaches, in which both sides created the facade of a friendship amid growing differences in perceptions, policies, and interests. Many Americans, in his account, were never sold on the idea that the relationship was primarily cooperative, but U.S. policy persisted nonetheless, based on the hope that the United States could socialize China. Harding sees the emergence of strategic competition as a gradual shift, and not the result of an external event such as the global financial crisis or Tiananmen. Rather, he writes, it was the result of an accumulation of differences and concerns on the U.S. side, combined with the arrival of U.S. President Donald Trump and a group of advisors composed of both national security hawks and economic nationalists who saw China as the primary threat to the United States. Trump's aggressive economic actions against China, combined with this tough rhetoric, led Chinese leaders to conclude that U.S. policy had shifted fundamentally. Harding attributes this sharp shift in U.S. policy to several variables. As the gap in relative capabilities expanded, the lack of any kind of binding force, such as a common threat or track record of cooperation, accelerated U.S. perceptions of competition. In particular, the differences in values and views of domestic governance contributed to a U.S. view of China as not only increasingly different, but as challenging to U.S. interests. Harding adds to the list factors such as differing visions of international order, China's growing ambitions, a Chinese sense of victimization, and America's desire to lead global rulemaking at the very time China wanted a greater voice and influence. Ultimately, Harding sees the U.S.-China relationship as a tragedy, in which the policymakers in Beijing and Washington valiantly but futilely fought against an unavoidable fate, strategic competition. Harding concludes that the U.S.-China relationship moving forward will be a shifting and evolving mix of cooperation, coexistence, competition, and confrontation, with the latter two being dominant features of bilateral interactions. In Chapter 4, From Reluctant Cooperation to Assertive Competition, Wang Jishu frames his historical account, from 1979 to 2022 as China's reaction to the strategic pressure of the United States.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?